The day was supposed to be a celebration. Jack Collins, former literature professor and lifelong advocate for social causes, had turned 65. He stood outside the towering glass mansion of his only son, Ethan Collins, feeling an unexpected knot in his stomach. He had been invited, more like summoned, for a dinner to celebrate his birthday, but the tension between him and Ethan had been brewing for years. As Jack knocked on the heavy door, he hoped that tonight might be different. Maybe, just maybe, Ethan would show him a flicker of the boy he used to know, the one who would run to him with a wide smile, eager to share his latest achievements, the one who still cared about people, about values beyond power and money. But that boy had long vanished, consumed by ambition in the ruthless world of billion-dollar tech deals. The door swung open, revealing Ethan, impeccably dressed as always, his sharp features cold and distant. "You're late," Ethan said, stepping aside just enough to let his father in. Jack entered the sleek, modern foyer, the air thick with silence. He could feel the tension. Ethan's house, perched high above the town on a hill, was more museum than home. The walls were lined with expensive art, minimalist furniture that screamed wealth but lacked any warmth. It was a sharp contrast to the humble, welcoming home Jack had raised his son in, where love filled the space between cracked walls and worn-out furniture. Ethan didn't bother with small talk. "We need to talk," he said, gesturing towards the living room. Jack followed, his heart sinking further with each step. He could feel it. This wasn't going to be a birthday dinner. No, something else was coming. They sat down, facing each other across the cold, granite coffee table. Ethan's eyes were sharp, his posture rigid. Jack waited, knowing his son would speak first. He always did. Ethan leaned forward, folding his hands, as if preparing for a business deal. "I've thought about this for a long time," Ethan began, his voice calm but laced with an undercurrent of resentment. "You've been living in that old house for too long. It's falling apart, just like your life." Jack frowned, already bracing himself for the blow. "Ethan," he started, but his son held up a hand, silencing him. "No, let me finish," Ethan said, his voice growing colder. "You've been a burden for years, clinging to your outdated ideals, thinking that people like you can still make a difference in this world. But the truth is, Dad, your time is up. You need to let go of this fantasy you're living in." Jack felt a pang of disbelief. This was his son, the boy he'd taught to value kindness, integrity, the very principles that now seemed laughable to him. "I don't understand," Jack said softly. "What are you saying?" Ethan's face hardened. "I'm saying you're done here. I've arranged everything. You'll leave tonight. There's no place for you here anymore." The words hit Jack like a physical blow. He stared at his son, searching for any sign of compassion, but there was none. Ethan was serious, cold, determined, and unmoved by the gravity of what he was doing. "I'm your father," Jack said, his voice trembling slightly. "How can you do this? How can you throw me out like this?" Ethan's expression didn't change. If anything, he seemed more resolved. "This isn't personal. It's practical. You don't belong in my world anymore. Go live on the streets if you have to. I don't care. Just stay out of my way." The room fell into a suffocating silence. Jack sat there, his heart pounding, his mind racing. How had it come to this? How had his own son become so heartless? Ethan stood, signaling that the conversation was over. "Happy birthday, Dad," he said with a cruel smile as he walked away. Jack remained seated for a moment, numb with shock. He felt the tears sting his eyes but forced them back. He wouldn't give Ethan the satisfaction of seeing him break. Without another word, Jack stood, the weight of his son's rejection heavy on his shoulders. He turned and walked out the door, not knowing where he would go, but knowing one thing for sure. He was no longer welcome in his own son's world. Jack walked down the driveway, the cool evening air biting at his skin. The mansion loomed behind him, its lights glowing like a distant memory, cold and indifferent. He didn't know where to go. His mind was still reeling from Ethan's cruel dismissal, each word echoing like a hammer blow in his chest. Go live on the streets? The weight of the moment pressed on Jack's heart, but he couldn't stop moving. His feet carried him down the winding road leading away from the hilltop estate, past towering trees and carefully manicured lawns that seemed foreign to him now. With each step, the memories of raising Ethan flashed in his mind. How hard he had worked, how much he had sacrificed. For what? To be thrown out like a stranger on his birthday. His steps quickened, and soon, Jack found himself in the heart of the small town below, far removed from Ethan's pristine, modern world. The sounds of life, the faint hum of traffic, the distant chatter of people, seemed almost alien to him. It had been years since he had wandered through town like this, and now, the streets felt unfamiliar, the faces of strangers passing by without a second glance. He stopped for a moment, looking around, lost in the place that once felt like home. His thoughts were interrupted by the rumbling of his stomach, a bitter reminder that he hadn't eaten since early morning. What now? The question hung heavy in the air, unanswered and daunting. Jack glanced at the few dollars in his wallet, a paltry sum that wouldn't last him long, but it was all he had. He wandered until he found a small, run-down diner tucked between two buildings, the neon sign flickering weakly. It was far from fancy, but at this point, Jack wasn't in a position to be picky. He stepped inside, the smell of grease and stale coffee hanging in the air. The place was nearly empty, save for a tired-looking waitress behind the counter and a couple of old men hunched over their meals. Jack slid into a booth near the window, grateful for the warmth inside. He stared blankly at the menu, not really seeing the words. His mind was still with Ethan, back in that cold house, wondering how things had gone so wrong. The waitress approached, her pen tapping against her notepad. "What'll it be, hon?" she asked, her voice flat but not unkind. Jack hesitated, his throat tight. Just coffee for now," he said quietly. The waitress nodded and shuffled off. As he waited, Jack's thoughts drifted again. He had no plan, no idea where he would go next. It wasn't the money that bothered him. He could survive on little. It was the loss of Ethan, the son he had raised with such care, now a man he barely recognized. Jack's heart ached with the weight of it. The coffee arrived, and Jack wrapped his hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into his bones. He stared into the dark liquid, his reflection staring back at him, older and more worn than he remembered. This wasn't how life was supposed to be. He was supposed to be celebrating his birthday with his son, not sitting alone in a diner, wondering where he'd sleep tonight. As the minutes passed, the bell above the diner's door jingled, and a group of men shuffled in, their clothes tattered, faces weathered by life on the streets. They moved quietly, sitting at a table in the corner, speaking in hushed tones. Jack watched them, feeling a strange kinship with these strangers. "Is this what I've been reduced to?" he thought. "Is this my future?" The thought made his chest tighten, but there was something else too, a flicker of curiosity. These men, despite their ragged appearances, seemed content. They laughed quietly, sharing stories as if they had known each other for years. Jack listened, half ashamed for eavesdropping, but unable to tear his attention away. There was a camaraderie here, a sense of belonging that he hadn't felt in a long time. His mind wandered back to Ethan, the bitterness rising again in his throat. How had his son become so heartless, so detached from the values he had once cherished? Jack took a deep breath, forcing the thoughts away. He had to focus on the present. Ethan's world was lost to him now, and it was time to find his own way forward, whatever that might look like. The door to the diner opened again, and this time, a familiar face stepped inside, Tommy, one of Jack's former students from years ago. His eyes widened in surprise as he spotted Jack sitting alone. He hesitated for a moment, then made his way over. "Mr. Collins?" Tommy asked, his voice filled with genuine surprise. "What are you doing here?" Jack looked up, startled to be recognized. For a moment, he didn't know what to say. "Just grabbing some coffee," he replied, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Tommy didn't miss the sadness in Jack's voice. He sat down across from him, concern etched on his face. "Is everything okay?" Jack's heart warmed slightly at the gesture. He had always taken pride in being a good teacher, in shaping young minds. Now, sitting here with Tommy, he realized that those connections still mattered. maybe more than he had thought. "I'm figuring things out," Jack said, his voice steady but tired. "Things have been complicated." Tommy nodded, understanding without pressing further. "If you need anything, Mr. Collins." "Anything at all, let me know." Jack smiled, a real smile this time, small but genuine. "Thanks, Tommy. I appreciate that." As Tommy stood to leave, Jack felt something he hadn't felt all day, a spark of hope. Maybe things weren't as bleak as they seemed. Maybe there was still a path forward, even if it wasn't the one he had expected. He sat back in the booth, taking a slow sip of his coffee, letting the warmth settle inside him. The night was far from over, but for the first time since he had left Ethan's mansion, Jack didn't feel completely lost. He wasn't sure where he was going yet, but he knew one thing: he wasn't giving up. Jack spent the night in a cheap motel, the kind with flickering lights and thin walls. The mattress sagged beneath him, and the sheets smelled faintly of mildew, but he didn't care. He lay on his back, staring up at the ceiling, the events of the day replaying in his mind like a broken record. "Go live on the streets, Dad." Ethan's words echoed through the silence, cold and unforgiving. Jack had always prided himself on his ability to teach and guide, to help people see the value in others. Yet here he was, discarded by the very person he had spent his life raising. He had done everything right, or at least, he thought he had. But somewhere along the way, Ethan had lost sight of the values Jack had tried to instill. Or maybe it was Jack who had lost sight of something. As the first light of dawn filtered through the thin curtains, Jack sat up, his body aching from a restless night. There was no point in staying here any longer. He didn't have much left. No home, no real direction. But he couldn't stay in this cramped room and wallow in self-pity. He needed to figure out his next steps. Jack packed what little he had into his worn duffel bag and headed out the door. The town was just waking up, the streets quiet but starting to buzz with life. He walked aimlessly for a while, passing shops opening for the day and the occasional jogger out for a morning run. The air was crisp, but Jack barely felt it. His mind was too preoccupied, spinning with uncertainty. Eventually, he found himself near the outskirts of town, where the buildings became fewer and the streets a little rougher. It was here, in the less polished parts of the city, that Jack had once spent his time volunteering. He had taught at local shelters, given lectures at the community center, and tried to make a difference in the lives of those who had little. That was years ago, though, before Ethan's success had pulled him into a different world. Now, standing outside the familiar brick building of a homeless shelter, Jack felt a pull he hadn't anticipated. He had come here out of curiosity, maybe even desperation, but seeing the shelter brought a strange sense of calm. These were the people he had always connected with, the ones society forgot about, just like Ethan had forgotten him. He hesitated at the entrance, unsure of what to do. He wasn't here to ask for help, at least, he didn't think he was. But maybe he could still find some purpose here. Maybe this was where he was meant to be. Pushing the door open, Jack stepped inside. The shelter was modest, crowded with people seeking warmth and food. Volunteers moved around, serving coffee and offering quiet words of comfort. It was a far cry from the sterile, luxurious world Ethan now inhabited, but it felt real. It felt right. A middle-aged man, graying at the temples but with kind eyes, approached Jack. "Looking for something, sir?" Jack cleared his throat, suddenly unsure how to explain why he was here. I used to volunteer here, a long time ago," he said. "Just thought I'd stop by." The man smiled. "Well, we're always happy to have someone with experience. My name's Greg. I run the place now. Did you know Susan?" Jack nodded, the name stirring memories of a woman who had dedicated her life to this shelter. "Yeah, I did. She was one of the best." Greg's face softened with warmth. "She sure was. I took over when she passed. Things are a bit different now, but we're still trying to keep her spirit alive. You thinking about volunteering again?" Jack hadn't come here with that intention, but hearing the offer, something inside him shifted. Maybe this was what he needed, something to ground him, to give him purpose again. "Yeah," he said, surprising even himself. "I think I'd like that." Greg's smile widened. "Great. We could always use more hands. Why don't you help me serve breakfast?" Jack nodded, grateful for the sense of direction, however small. He spent the next few hours moving through the crowded dining area, handing out plates of scrambled eggs and toast to the men and women who shuffled through. As he worked, he listened to their stories, some heartbreaking, some hopeful, and found himself reconnecting with a part of himself he had lost over the years. One man, his beard long and his eyes tired but bright, thanked Jack as he handed him a plate. "You're new here, aren't you?" the man asked. Jack smiled softly. "I guess you could say that." The man chuckled. "Well, you've got that look about you. Like you don't quite know where you're supposed to be yet." Jack's smile faded slightly, the truth of the man's words hitting harder than he expected. "Yeah, I'm still figuring that out." The man nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You'll get there. Life's funny that way. Sometimes it takes a wrong turn to end up in the right place." Jack watched the man walk away, his words lingering in the air. Maybe this was his wrong turn. Maybe losing everything was the wake-up call he needed. As the morning wore on, Jack's mind kept circling back to Ethan, to the way his son had thrown him out with so little care. But now, standing among people who had lost even more than he had, Jack realized something. He wasn't alone. He wasn't as lost as he had thought. By the time breakfast was over, Jack felt a strange sense of peace. He was far from figuring things out, and he knew his relationship with Ethan was broken in ways he didn't know how to fix. But here, in this place, surrounded by people who knew what it meant to struggle, he found a flicker of hope. Greg approached him as the last few people finished their meals. "You did good today," he said. "You think you'll come back tomorrow?" Jack looked around the room, the faces of those he had helped, and nodded. "Yeah, I'll be back." And for the first time in a long time, Jack meant it. Jack returned to the shelter the next morning, as promised. He woke early, feeling a strange mix of purpose and uncertainty. The world outside still seemed foreign to him, but within the walls of the shelter, he had found something that felt solid. It wasn't much, but it was enough to get him out of bed and moving forward. As he walked through the town, he noticed the stark contrast between the quiet, struggling streets he now frequented and the sleek, affluent world he had once shared with Ethan. The memory of his son's face, cold, indifferent, still haunted him, but Jack pushed it aside. There would be time to deal with that later. Right now, he needed to focus on something he could control. The shelter was already buzzing with activity when he arrived. Greg greeted him with a nod and a smile, handing him a tray of bread to distribute. Jack fell into the rhythm of the place easily, helping prepare the morning meal and chatting with the other volunteers. There was a simple comfort in the routine, in knowing that his actions, small as they were making a difference for someone. As the morning passed, the shelter filled with the usual crowd, people Jack was starting to recognize by face, if not by name. He moved through the room, handing out meals and exchanging brief conversations. There was one man, though, who stood out more than the others. Seated in the corner, with a worn coat and a scruffy beard, was an older man who seemed to command quiet respect from those around him. People greeted him with warmth, offering him extra coffee or a kind word. Jack had noticed him the day before, but hadn't had the chance to speak with him. Today, though, something compelled him to make the connection. Carrying 2 cups of coffee, Jack made his way over to the man's table. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, offering one of the cups. The man looked up, his sharp blue eyes taking Jack in for a moment before nodding. "Sure, sit. You're the new guy, right?" Jack smiled, sitting down across from him. "Yeah, I guess you could say that. Name's Jack." "Frank," the man replied, shaking his hand with a firm grip. "You've been doing good work here. Greg says you're a quick learner." Jack chuckled, shaking his head. "Just trying to help where I can." Frank sipped his coffee, watching Jack carefully, as if measuring him. "I've seen your kind before," he said after a moment. "You're not from around here, are you? At least, not from this side of town." Jack didn't take offense to the observation. Frank was right. He didn't belong here. At least, not in the way the others did. "No," Jack admitted, looking down at his cup. "I used to live up on the hill." Frank raised an eyebrow. "The hill? Huh? Fancy. What happened? Did the money run out?" Jack hesitated, the weight of the truth pressing down on him. No, not the money, he said quietly. It's my son. We don't see eye to eye anymore. He kicked me out. Frank didn't look surprised. Instead, he nodded slowly, as if he had seen this story play out many times before. Family, he said, leaning back in his chair. They can lift you up or drag you down. Sounds like yours dragged you down. Jack felt a pang of guilt at Frank's words. He didn't want to think of Ethan as the villain in this story. It wasn't that simple. It's not just his fault, Jack said, surprising himself with the honesty. I raised him to be the man he is. Maybe I didn't see what he was becoming. Frank studied him for a moment, then nodded. Takes guts to admit that. Most people just blame others for their problems. I've seen it 100 times in this place. Jack felt the weight of Frank's words settle in his chest. He had spent so much time being angry at Ethan, hurt by his actions, that he hadn't stopped to think about his own role in their broken relationship. Maybe he had been too focused on shaping Ethan into the man he thought he should be, without really seeing who his son had become. Before Jack could respond, the door to the shelter swung open, and a gust of cold air blew through the room. A group of newcomers entered, their faces familiar to Frank. He stood up, excusing himself from the table with a nod. Looks like I've got some people to talk to. You hang in there, Jack. Jack watched him go, feeling both lighter and heavier at the same time. Frank's words echoed in his mind, stirring thoughts he hadn't been ready to confront. Family can lift you up or drag you down. Jack had always believed he had done the right thing for Ethan, but now, he wasn't so sure. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Jack worked alongside the volunteers, feeling more at ease with each passing hour. The shelter had become a place of refuge for him, not just physically, but emotionally. It gave him something to focus on, something to hold on to while he figured out the rest of his life. By the time evening rolled around, Jack was exhausted but content. He said his goodbyes to Greg and the others, promising to return the next day. As he stepped outside into the crisp night air, he felt a strange sense of clarity settling over him. He still had no idea how to fix things with Ethan, or if they could even be fixed, but for the first time, he wasn't consumed by that uncertainty. Jack began walking back towards the motel, his breath visible in the cold air. The streets were quiet now, the town winding down for the night. He thought of Ethan, probably sitting in his sleek, modern house, surrounded by the trappings of success. Jack wondered if his son ever thought about him, if he felt even the slightest bit of regret for what he had done. The thought made Jack's chest tighten, but he pushed it aside. He couldn't control Ethan's actions, only his own. And for now, that was enough. As he approached the motel, Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out, half expecting some automated message or spam call. But when he looked at the screen, he froze. It was Ethan. Jack stood there, staring at the phone as it buzzed in his hand. His heart raced, a flood of emotions hitting him all at once. He didn't know why Ethan was calling, and a part of him didn't want to know. But another part, the part that was still a father, still hopeful, wanted to answer. Before he could stop himself, Jack pressed the button and brought the phone to his ear. "Dad," came Ethan's voice, strained and uncertain. "We need to talk." Jack's throat tightened. He wasn't sure what to expect, but he knew one thing. This conversation could change everything. Jack stood frozen, the phone pressed to his ear, Ethan's voice still echoing in his mind. For a moment, he couldn't speak, his throat tight with the weight of 100 unspoken words. Ethan had called him. Why? What had changed? He swallowed hard, pushing past the hesitation. "Ethan," he said, his voice rough with exhaustion. "What is it? Why are you calling?" There was a pause on the other end, a silence so thick that Jack could almost hear his son's internal struggle. When Ethan finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost hesitant, so unlike the sharp, confident tone Jack had become accustomed to. I've been thinking," Ethan began, his words slow, as if he were carefully choosing each one. "About what happened. About what I said." Jack's pulse quickened. Was this it? Was Ethan finally realizing what he had done? He wanted to hope, but he kept his voice steady, afraid that one wrong word might shatter the fragile moment. "And?" Jack prompted gently, trying to keep the flood of emotions at bay. Ethan sighed, and Jack could picture him pacing in his sleek office or standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. Things haven't been going well lately, Ethan admitted. I made some mistakes. The business, it's not what it was. I guess I've been thinking about you more than I realized. Jack felt his chest tighten. This wasn't an apology, not yet, but it was the closest Ethan had come in a long time. He didn't want to push too hard, but he couldn't help asking, why now? Why are you calling me now, Ethan? There was another pause, longer this time. When Ethan spoke again, his voice was strained. I don't know. I keep hearing your voice in my head, Dad. About how things used to be. About what you taught me. He hesitated. And I can't shake the feeling that maybe I've lost something important. Jack's heart clenched. This was it. The crack in the wall that had kept them apart for so long. He wanted to reach through the phone, to pull his son back from the edge of whatever darkness had swallowed him. But Jack also knew Ethan too well. This wasn't the time to give in to emotion. Not yet. I always tried to teach you what mattered, Jack said carefully, keeping his tone calm. And it wasn't the money. It wasn't the success. I know that, Ethan snapped, a sudden burst of defensiveness in his voice. But it's different now, Dad. You wouldn't understand. Jack closed his eyes, the sting of those words hitting him harder than he wanted to admit. I wouldn't understand, he repeated, his voice steady but firm. Try me. There was a beat of silence, and Jack could hear Ethan's breath catch. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost broken. Everything's falling apart, Dad. The company, the investors, they're losing faith. We're hemorrhaging money, and I don't know how to fix it. I thought I could handle it, but I don't know anymore. The vulnerability in Ethan's voice was so raw that Jack almost didn't recognize it. His son, the man who had always been so sure of himself, was crumbling. Jack's heart ached, but there was also a flicker of something else, something close to hope. I see, Jack said softly. And what do you want from me? Ethan didn't respond right away. Jack could hear the faint sound of traffic in the background, the distant hum of city life moving on without them. He waited, the weight of the conversation settling heavily between them. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Dad. I don't know what I want from you. I just needed to hear your voice. Jack's breath caught in his throat. He wasn't sure what to say, how to respond to that. Ethan had pushed him away for so long, built up walls that seemed impenetrable, and now here he was, reaching out, even if he didn't know how. Ethan, Jack said, his voice gentle, I'm still here. I always will be. But you've got to want this. You've got to be ready to face what's been broken between us. Ethan was silent, the only sound the faint rustle of movement on his end of the line. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, the seconds stretching out into what felt like an eternity. I know, Ethan finally said, his voice barely audible. I don't know if I can fix it. Jack closed his eyes, his heart heavy with a mixture of hope and pain. You don't have to fix it alone, he said quietly, but you've got to take the first step. I can't do that for you. The line was quiet for so long that Jack wondered if Ethan had hung up. But then, he heard a soft sigh on the other end. Maybe we could talk, Ethan said, almost reluctantly. In person, I mean. Jack felt a surge of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Relief. He nodded, even though Ethan couldn't see him. Yeah, Jack said, his voice steady but filled with quiet emotion. I think that'd be a good place to start. Ethan didn't say anything more, but Jack could sense the unspoken understanding between them. There was still so much left to mend, so many words unsaid, but for now, this was enough. It had to be. I'll call you tomorrow, Ethan finally said, his voice sounding a little stronger, a little more sure. Jack nodded again, swallowing past the lump in his throat. Okay, tomorrow. The call ended, leaving Jack standing there in the cold night air, the phone still in his hand. He stared at the screen for a moment, processing what had just happened. It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't a reconciliation. But it was something, an opening. And that was more than Jack had dared to hope for. Tucking the phone into his pocket, Jack continued walking back to the motel, his steps a little lighter than they had been before. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like there was a chance, however small, that things could be different. That maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. And that was a start. The next day arrived with an uneasy mix of anticipation and dread. Jack woke early, his mind heavy with thoughts of Ethan and the conversation they had shared. He had spent half the night replaying every word, wondering what had driven his son to reach out after months of silence. Now, the day stretched out before him, and with it came the possibility of something he hadn't dared to hope for: reconciliation. Jack dressed quickly, his movements automatic, though his mind was far from the small, cramped motel room he stood in. He had agreed to meet Ethan at a quiet cafe on the outskirts of town, a neutral place where the weight of their past wouldn't press down so heavily. Jack's heart pounded as he walked, the cool morning air doing little to calm the storm of emotions brewing inside him. He had been here before, on the edge of hope, only to have it slip away. But this time, something felt different. The cafe was small and unassuming, tucked away from the bustling main streets. Jack arrived a little early, taking a seat near the window where he could watch the door. His hands trembled slightly as he wrapped them around the warm cup of coffee the waitress had brought him, though he hadn't ordered it yet. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. Jack's mind raced, filled with memories of Ethan as a boy, full of life and promise, and the man he had become, hardened by success, distanced by ambition. What had happened to the young man who once sought his father's approval, who cared about the world beyond his own accomplishments? As Jack stirred the coffee absent-mindedly, the door jingled, and Ethan walked in. Jack's breath caught in his throat. Ethan stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the cafe until his eyes landed on his father. For a second, their gazes locked, and Jack saw something there. Something fragile, almost vulnerable. But then it was gone, replaced by the guarded expression Ethan wore so well. Ethan crossed the room with purposeful steps and sat down across from Jack without a word. The silence between them was thick, heavy with unspoken emotions. Jack could feel the tension in his son's posture, the way his hands rested stiffly on the table, as if he were bracing himself for something. "Thanks for coming," Jack said quietly, breaking the silence. He kept his tone gentle, cautious, knowing that one wrong move could send Ethan retreating back into the cold distance that had defined their relationship for so long. Ethan nodded, his eyes briefly flicking to the cup of coffee in front of him before returning to his father. "I wasn't sure if I would," he admitted, his voice low, almost reluctant. "But I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation last night." Jack studied his son's face, searching for the boy he once knew beneath the man who sat before him. "What changed, Ethan?" he asked, his voice soft but direct. "Why now?" Ethan sighed, leaning back in his chair, his eyes drifting to the window as if looking for an escape. "I don't know," he said after a moment, his voice tight. "Everything's been falling apart, and I've been lost. I thought I had it all figured out. I thought I could do it on my own. But the company's in trouble, and I keep hearing your voice in my head, reminding me of everything I used to care about. I don't know who I am anymore." Jack's heart twisted at the rawness in Ethan's words. He had waited so long to hear this, to see the cracks in the armor his son had built around himself. But he knew better than to push too hard, too fast. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," Jack said gently. "It's okay to feel lost. We all do sometimes." Ethan looked down at his hands, his jaw clenched. "I'm not supposed to be lost, Dad. I'm supposed to be in control. That's what everyone expects from me." Jack leaned forward, his voice soft but firm. "It's not about what other people expect. It's about what you expect from yourself." For the first time, Ethan met Jack's eyes, and the vulnerability that flickered there made Jack's heart ache. He could see the weight Ethan carried, the pressure of living up to an image, of maintaining a facade that had begun to crack. "I've made so many mistakes," Ethan said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I pushed you away. I lost sight of what really mattered. And now, I don't know how to fix it." Jack reached across the table, resting his hand gently on top of Ethan's. "We all make mistakes, Ethan. It's part of life. But what matters is that you're here now, that you're willing to try. Ethan's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but he didn't pull his hand away. For a moment, they sat there in silence, the distance between them closing in a way that felt tentative but real. It wasn't a perfect solution. It wasn't even an apology, but it was a start. Jack withdrew his hand, letting the moment breathe. "You don't have to fix everything overnight," he said softly. "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be willing to take the next step." Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze shifting to the cup of coffee in front of him. He picked it up, cradling it in his hands as if seeking warmth from the gesture. "I don't know if I can fix the company," he admitted, his voice thick with uncertainty. "I've screwed things up too much." Jack watched him for a moment, then leaned forward, his voice steady. "Maybe you can't fix it alone, but you don't have to." Ethan looked up, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Jack took a deep breath, the weight of his next words settling over him. "I know the business world isn't where I spent my life, but I do know people. I know how to work through problems, how to find solutions when things seem impossible." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "If you'll let me, I want to help. Not just with the company, but with everything. With us." Ethan's eyes widened slightly, as if the offer had taken him by surprise. He stared at his father for a long moment, the internal struggle playing out on his face. Jack could see the walls Ethan had built around himself, the fear of letting anyone in, even his own father. But then, slowly, Ethan nodded. "I don't know where to start," he admitted, his voice softer now, less defensive. Jack smiled, a small, hopeful smile. "We'll figure it out. Together." Ethan didn't say anything, but the tension in his shoulders seemed to ease, if only slightly. He took a sip of his coffee, his gaze drifting back to the window, where the morning sunlight filtered through the glass. It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't a sweeping moment of reconciliation, but it was something, an opening, a crack in the walls Ethan had built around himself. And for Jack, that was enough. For now, they sat together in the quiet cafe, the silence between them no longer heavy with unspoken bitterness, but with something else, something that felt like the beginning of healing. And as Jack watched his son, he felt the flicker of hope grow a little brighter. Over the next few weeks, Jack and Ethan began a delicate dance of rebuilding their relationship. It wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't quick. There were days when the old wounds bled, when anger or silence crept back in, threatening to tear open the fragile progress they had made. But Jack could see that Ethan was trying, in his own way, to let him back in. And Jack was determined to meet him halfway, no matter how rocky the road. They started meeting regularly, always in the same small cafe. The setting became a kind of neutral ground for them, a place where they could talk without the weight of the past pressing down on them quite as hard. Each conversation inched them closer, the walls between them slowly eroding. One crisp morning, as the first signs of fall crept into the air, they met again. Jack arrived early, as he often did, taking his usual seat by the window. This time, though, he wasn't waiting with the usual nerves clenching his stomach. He felt lighter now, more at ease. Their talks had been more open lately, less guarded. Ethan had started to share things, small admissions about the company, about the stress he'd been under, and, occasionally, about how much pressure he had put on himself to live up to an impossible standard. But today felt different. Jack sensed it in the air before Ethan even arrived. When Ethan finally walked in, Jack noticed the tension in his son's shoulders, the way he carried himself like a man bracing for impact. Ethan ordered a coffee and sat down across from Jack, not saying anything at first, just staring into his cup. Jack waited, sensing that Ethan needed the silence to gather himself. After a long moment, Ethan let out a deep breath, his voice quieter than usual when he finally spoke. "I need your help, Dad." The words hung in the air, and Jack felt the weight of them. This wasn't just about their relationship anymore. This was Ethan letting him in, really letting him in, for the first time since everything had fallen apart. Jack leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but steady. "What's going on?" Ethan's hands tightened around his coffee cup, and he shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "The company's worse off than I let on. We're hemorrhaging money, and the investors are starting to pull out. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could fix it on my own. But I can't." Jack listened, his heart heavy. Ethan had always prided himself on being in control, on being the one with all the answers. Admitting he needed help was monumental, and Jack wasn't about to underestimate how much it had cost Ethan to say those words. "What happened?" Jack asked gently. "What changed?" Ethan let out a hollow laugh, rubbing a hand over his face. "I got too greedy. I expanded too fast, took risks I shouldn't have. I wanted to be the best, to prove to everyone that I could do it better than anyone else. But now, I'm in over my head, and I don't know how to get out." Jack sat back, considering his son's words. He could see the weight Ethan was carrying, the crushing pressure of trying to hold everything together when it was all unraveling around him. Jack had never been a businessman, but he knew something about people. He knew something about rebuilding, about finding a way forward when the path seemed impossible. "Ethan," Jack said carefully, his voice steady, "it's not about the money. It's never been about the money. What matters is how you move forward from here." Ethan looked up, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "What if it's too late? What if I've already screwed everything up?" Jack smiled softly, shaking his head. "It's never too late to change direction. You've recognized where you went wrong. That's the first step. Now, you need to focus on fixing what you can, and accepting that you might have to let go of some things." Ethan stared into his coffee, his jaw tight. "Let go of what, though? The company? Everything I've worked for?" Jack leaned in, his voice quiet but firm. "Maybe not everything, but you might have to rethink what success looks like for you. It doesn't have to be about being the best or having the most. It's about finding balance, about doing something that matters. Not just for you, but for the people around you." Ethan didn't respond right away, and Jack could see the struggle in his eyes, the fear of failure, the fear of letting go of the image he had built for himself. But Jack also saw something else, the faint glimmer of understanding. "I've spent so much time chasing this idea of what success should look like," Ethan said quietly. "And now, I don't even know if it's what I want." Jack felt a surge of hope. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. "Then maybe it's time to redefine what success means for you." Ethan let out a shaky breath, his eyes filled with uncertainty but also something close to relief. "I don't know if I can do that, Dad. I don't even know where to start." Jack smiled, his heart full of quiet pride for his son. "You don't have to do it all at once. You just have to start somewhere." For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Jack could feel the shift happening, the slow but steady unraveling of everything that had kept them apart for so long. Ethan looked up, his expression softer than Jack had seen in years. "I need you with me on this," he said, his voice filled with something close to vulnerability. "I can't do it without you." Jack's chest tightened, but it wasn't with pain this time. It was with hope. He reached across the table, resting his hand on Ethan's. "I'm here, Ethan. I always have been, and I'm not going anywhere." Ethan nodded, his eyes filled with something Jack hadn't seen in years, trust. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't a quick fix, but it was a start, a real start. As they left the cafe together, Jack felt lighter than he had in years. The road ahead would still be long, and there would be setbacks, but they were facing it together now. And for the first time in a long time, Jack felt like they might actually make it through to the other side. Ethan walked beside him, silent but present, and Jack couldn't help but think of the boy his son used to be, the one who had looked up to him with wide, eager eyes, trusting him to know the way. And now, all these years later, it was happening again. Jack smiled to himself as they stepped out into the crisp fall air, the leaves swirling around their feet in a quiet dance. They still had so much work to do, but for the first time in what felt like forever, they weren't walking separate paths. They were walking together. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Ethan and Jack, now closer than they had been in years, worked side by side to rebuild the company and repair the fractured foundation beneath their relationship. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks, sleepless nights, and moments when everything seemed on the verge of collapse. But for the first time in a long time, they weren't facing it alone. They were a team. Ethan had reluctantly come to terms with the fact that parts of the business would need to be let go. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but Jack's steady presence grounded him. Together, they assessed what could be salvaged and what had to be sacrificed. Each day brought difficult decisions, but Jack's calm perspective was a constant reminder to focus on what truly mattered. One evening, after a long day of meetings and phone calls with investors, they sat in Ethan's office, the space quiet save for the ticking of a clock on the wall. The city skyline glittered beyond the windows, but inside, there was a sense of exhaustion mixed with tentative hope. Ethan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, his face lined with fatigue. "I don't know how you've kept your sanity through all of this," Ethan said, glancing at his father, who sat across from him, a notebook open in his lap. Jack chuckled softly, the sound warm and reassuring. "It's not about keeping your sanity," he replied. "It's about knowing what's worth holding on to and what you can let go of." Ethan nodded, his eyes distant as he stared out at the city lights. "I guess I'm still figuring that part out." Jack studied his son for a moment, seeing not the man who had once seemed untouchable, but someone who was still learning, still growing. "You've already come a long way," Jack said gently. "And the fact that you're willing to let go of things that don't serve you anymore, that's progress." Ethan looked over at Jack, something close to gratitude flickering in his eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you, Dad." Jack smiled, feeling the warmth of those words settle into his heart. It had been a long journey to get to this point, but hearing that, knowing that Ethan not only saw but appreciated his presence, was worth every moment of uncertainty. As the night wore on, their conversation turned to the future, not just of the company, but of their relationship. Ethan had begun to open up more, sharing things Jack had never expected to hear. About the pressure he had felt for years to live up to an impossible standard, about the fear of failure that had driven him to make reckless decisions. Jack listened, offering advice when needed, but mostly just letting Ethan talk. He knew how much his son had been holding in, and now that the dam had broken, the words spilled out, raw and honest. "I guess I thought success meant never showing weakness," Ethan admitted quietly. "Like I had to prove to everyone, and to myself, that I could handle anything." Jack shook his head, his voice soft but firm. "Success isn't about being invincible, Ethan. It's about being able to adapt, to learn, and to grow from your mistakes. No one has all the answers, and no one should expect you to." Ethan sighed, his shoulders sagging as if the weight of those words were sinking in. "I think that's been the hardest part, accepting that I don't have all the answers." Jack reached across the desk, resting his hand on Ethan's. "The fact that you're willing to admit that shows how much you've grown." Ethan looked at his father, the gratitude deepening in his eyes. "I've learned a lot from you these past few weeks," he said quietly. "Not just about the company, but about myself." Jack's heart swelled with pride. It had taken years to get to this point, but now, sitting here with his son, he knew they were finally on the right path. They had both changed, both grown, and now they were moving forward together. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, Jack stood, stretching his stiff limbs. "We should call it a night," he said, his voice laced with tiredness. "We've got a lot of work ahead of us tomorrow." Ethan nodded, standing as well. But before Jack could leave, Ethan stopped him with a quiet, "Dad?" Jack turned, raising an eyebrow. "I've been thinking," Ethan continued, his voice hesitant but sincere, "about the things that really matter. And I've realized I want to do something that makes a difference, not just for me, but for others." Jack's smile was slow and full of understanding. "What do you have in mind?" Ethan hesitated, the idea still forming in his mind, but there was a new light in his eyes. "I don't know all the details yet, but I want to shift the focus of the company. Use what I've built to give back. Maybe start some kind of foundation or program that helps people, especially people who've been through tough times." Jack felt a swell of pride, a warmth spreading through his chest. This was the son he had always believed in, the one who had a heart for people, even when it had been buried beneath layers of ambition and pressure. "That sounds like a great idea," Jack said, his voice full of support. "And I'll be there with you every step of the way." Ethan's gaze softened, a hint of vulnerability lingering in his expression. "Thanks, Dad. I don't know if I've said it enough, but I'm really grateful for everything you've done, for sticking with me, even when I didn't deserve it. Jack felt his throat tighten with emotion, but he kept his voice steady. You don't have to thank me, Ethan. That's what family does. We don't give up on each other. Ethan nodded, his eyes glistening slightly. I won't forget that. The weight of those words hung in the air, a promise between father and son. A promise that no matter how hard things got, they would face it together. They left the office side by side, stepping into the quiet of the night. The streets were empty, the world around them still, but inside, Jack's heart was alive with hope. They had come so far, and there was still a long road ahead, but for the first time, Jack knew without a doubt that they were walking towards something good. As they parted ways for the night, Jack looked up at the clear sky, the stars scattered like diamonds overhead. He had never been one for signs, but tonight, the stars felt like a quiet reassurance, a reminder that no matter how dark things had gotten, there was always light waiting on the other side. And as Jack walked home, the quiet city around him, he felt a peace he hadn't felt in years. The following weeks brought a whirlwind of change. Ethan and Jack's relationship continued to strengthen, but now their focus shifted towards something larger. The company was stabilizing, thanks in part to difficult but necessary decisions. Ethan had accepted the fact that they had to downsize, selling off parts of the business to regain financial footing. It wasn't easy, but he had learned from his father that real growth often came from the hardest choices. But beyond the business, Ethan's new vision began to take shape. His desire to give back had grown into something tangible, a foundation aimed at helping those who had fallen on hard times, just like the people Jack had worked with for years. It was a dream Ethan had never allowed himself to consider before, too caught up in the pursuit of success. Now, it was becoming a reality, and Jack couldn't have been prouder. One afternoon, they sat together in the conference room of what used to be the company's headquarters. The energy in the room was different now, not driven by profit margins or stock prices, but by the excitement of building something meaningful. Papers were spread out before them, sketches of plans for the foundation, names of potential partners, ideas for community programs that could provide real change. We'll start small, Ethan said, tapping his pen against the table. Focus on local communities first. Homeless shelters, job training programs, mentorship for underprivileged youth. We could even partner with schools to offer scholarships. Jack nodded, leaning back in his chair as he looked over the sketches. It's a good start, he agreed. But remember, this is more than just another business venture. You're dealing with people's lives. You have to approach it with your heart, not just your head. Ethan smiled, a soft chuckle escaping him. That's something I've been learning from you, Dad. Jack felt a warmth in his chest at those words. He had watched his son transform over these past months, shedding the layers of arrogance and ambition that had once consumed him. What was left now was the man Jack had always believed Ethan could be. A man who cared, who wanted to make a difference. As they continued to discuss the next steps for the foundation, Jack noticed a new energy in Ethan. It wasn't the frantic drive for perfection that used to push him to exhaustion. This was something steadier, more grounded. For the first time, Ethan was building something not to prove himself, but because he genuinely believed in it. By the time they wrapped up their meeting, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow through the tall windows. Ethan gathered the papers into a neat stack and stood, stretching his arms above his head. I feel like we're finally getting somewhere, he said, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Jack stood as well, patting his son on the back. You are, he said softly, and you're doing it for all the right reasons. Ethan's smile widened, but then it faltered slightly, a hint of uncertainty clouding his eyes. Do you really think this can work? He asked, his voice quieter now. That I can do this? Jack met his gaze, his voice steady and full of conviction. I know you can. You've already proven that you're capable of so much more than you ever thought. Ethan looked down for a moment, his hands tightening around the stack of papers. I spent so many years chasing the wrong things. Sometimes, it feels like I've wasted so much time. Jack shook his head, stepping closer to his son. Time spent learning is never wasted, Ethan. You had to go through all of that to become the man you are now. And what you're doing now, It matters. It'll make a difference. Ethan nodded, his eyes softening. I just want to make you proud, Dad. Jack's heart swelled, a wave of emotion washing over him. He had waited so long to hear those words, and now, standing here, he knew there was nothing more his son could do to make him proud. Ethan had already done it, by growing, by changing, by finding his way back to what really mattered. You already have, Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. You always have. The moment between them felt like a quiet victory, a culmination of all the hard work, the pain, and the healing they had gone through. There was still so much ahead, but for now, this was enough. As they left the office together, Ethan's phone buzzed. He pulled it out of his pocket, glancing at the screen. A frown crossed his face, and Jack immediately noticed the shift in his son's demeanor. What is it? Jack asked, his voice laced with concern. Ethan hesitated, his eyes scanning the message. It's from the lawyers, he said slowly. There's an issue with one of the investors. It looks like they're trying to block the foundation's funding. They're claiming we didn't disclose certain financials properly during the sale. Jack's stomach tightened. Just when things had seemed to be moving forward, another roadblock had appeared. But he kept his voice calm, steady. We'll deal with it, he said firmly. We've faced worse. We can handle this. Ethan looked at him, his brow furrowed with worry. I thought we were past all this, he murmured. I thought we were finally in the clear. Jack rested a hand on his son's shoulder. This is just part of the process, Ethan. It's not going to be easy, but we'll get through it. You've come too far to let something like this stop you now. Ethan took a deep breath, nodding slowly. You're right, he said, though his voice still held traces of frustration. We'll figure it out. As they stepped out into the cool evening air, Jack couldn't help but feel a familiar sense of determination rising within him. They had overcome so much already. This was just another challenge, another obstacle to face together. And this time, Jack knew they had the strength to push through. They walked in silence for a while, the city alive with the sounds of traffic and distant conversations. But the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was filled with the quiet understanding that they would face whatever came next, side by side. As they reached the corner of the street where they would part ways for the night, Ethan turned to his father, his expression more resolved. Thanks for sticking with me through all of this, he said, his voice sincere. I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't been there. Jack smiled, his heart full. You don't ever have to thank me, Ethan. I'll always be here. That's what fathers do. Ethan smiled back, and for a moment, the years of tension, of distance, seemed like a distant memory. They weren't just father and son now. They were partners, working together towards something bigger than either of them. As Ethan walked away, Jack watched him go, a deep sense of pride settling over him. It had been a long journey, full of pain and struggle, but now, Jack knew without a doubt that they were headed in the right direction. And no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The weeks that followed were a test of everything Jack and Ethan had rebuilt. The legal issue with the investors escalated quickly, threatening to undo all of the progress they had made. It was a bitter reminder that the world Ethan had once dominated could turn on him at any moment and for a time. The uncertainty weighed heavily on both of them, but through it all, they stood together. Each day brought a new challenge, a new problem to solve, but they faced them side by side, never retreating into old habits of silence or distance. Jack's steady presence grounded Ethan, and when the pressure seemed unbearable, Ethan no longer hid it. He shared it with his father. Late one night, after hours of poring over legal documents, Jack and Ethan sat in Ethan's office, the only light coming from the dim glow of a desk lamp. The silence between them wasn't tense, just filled with the exhaustion of men who had been fighting for something they believed in. I don't know how much more of this I can take, Ethan admitted, leaning back in his chair, rubbing his tired eyes. Every time we think we've turned a corner, something else hits us. Jack leaned back as well, his fingers tracing the edge of the legal document in front of him. He had spent his life reading literature, not contracts, but over these past months, he had become as familiar with corporate jargon as he had once been with classic novels. Still, he knew this was about more than paperwork. It was about Ethan's struggle to redefine his life and his legacy. "Life's never as simple as turning a corner," Jack said softly. "Sometimes you have to carve out your own path, even when it feels like the world's pushing against you." Ethan looked over at his father, his brow furrowed. "Do you ever get tired of fighting, Dad? I mean, after everything?" Jack smiled faintly, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Of course I do. Everyone gets tired. But you don't give up just because things are hard. You keep going because, in the end, the fight is what makes it all worth it." Ethan didn't respond right away. He stared down at the papers scattered across his desk, lost in thought. Then, slowly, he nodded. "You're right. I've come too far to let it all fall apart now." Jack could see the resolve in Ethan's eyes, stronger now than it had been even a few months ago. He had seen his son grow, not just as a businessman, but as a man. Ethan had learned that success wasn't about never failing. It was about how you responded when failure seemed inevitable. And now, with the foundation still in jeopardy, Ethan was ready to fight for it. Not because he needed to prove himself, but because he believed in it. Because he knew that this was about more than just saving his reputation or his fortune. This was about creating something that would last, something that would help people in ways that really mattered. "I'm going to see this through," Ethan said quietly, his voice filled with determination. "Whatever it takes." Jack smiled, feeling a deep sense of pride. "I know you will." The next few days were a blur of meetings, negotiations, and tense conversations with lawyers. The investor issue became more complicated, and for a time, it looked like the foundation might never get off the ground. But Jack and Ethan kept pushing. They made difficult concessions, worked through long nights, and refused to let the setbacks break them. Then, one morning, after weeks of uncertainty, the breakthrough finally came. Ethan received a call from the head lawyer representing the investors, and as Jack watched from across the desk, he saw Ethan's face slowly shift, from tension to disbelief, and then to a slow, dawning realization. When Ethan hung up, his hands were shaking slightly, but there was a smile on his face, one of relief and triumph. "They backed down," Ethan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're letting the foundation move forward." Jack stood, his heart pounding with a mixture of pride and joy. He crossed the room and pulled his son into a tight embrace. It was the first time in years that Ethan had let himself show such vulnerability, and for a moment, they just stood there, father and son, holding onto the victory they had fought so hard for. When they finally pulled apart, Ethan's eyes were bright with emotion. "We did it, Dad." Jack smiled, nodding. "We did." The weeks that followed were filled with a kind of energy Jack hadn't seen in Ethan for a long time. The foundation launched, starting small but with a clear mission: to provide resources, support, and opportunities for those who needed it most. Ethan threw himself into the work, not with the frantic, restless energy that had once defined him, but with a sense of purpose that Jack knew came from a deeper place. The first project was a partnership with the very homeless shelter where Jack had volunteered for years. Together, they created a program that offered job training and mentorship to people who were struggling to rebuild their lives. It wasn't just about giving money. It was about giving people the tools they needed to build something lasting for themselves. On the day the program launched, Jack stood beside Ethan in front of a small crowd gathered at the shelter. There were no flashing lights, no reporters or cameras, just a quiet group of people ready to start their journey toward a better life. As Jack looked out at the faces of those who had been given a second chance, he felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for this moment, for the journey he and Ethan had taken to get here. When Ethan stepped forward to speak, Jack watched with quiet pride as his son addressed the crowd, his voice steady, his words filled with sincerity. There was no pretense, no need to impress. Ethan was speaking from the heart, and Jack could see the connection he was making with the people in front of him. "This isn't about me," Ethan said, his voice carrying across the small space. "It's about all of us. It's about what we can do when we come together to lift each other up. I've spent a lot of time chasing the wrong things, but now I'm ready to do something that really matters." Jack's chest swelled with emotion as he listened to Ethan's words. This was the man he had always known his son could be. The man who cared, who wanted to make a difference in the world. When Ethan finished speaking, the crowd erupted into quiet applause. Jack stepped forward, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder, and for a moment, they stood together, father and son, looking out at the future they had built. It hadn't been an easy journey. There had been pain, mistakes, and moments of doubt. But standing there in the warmth of that small gathering, Jack knew that they had made it. They had found their way back to each other, and in the process, they had created something that would live on long after they were gone. As the crowd began to disperse, Ethan turned to his father, his eyes filled with quiet gratitude. "Thanks for never giving up on me," he said softly. Jack smiled, his heart full. "I never will." If you enjoyed this heartwarming story about overcoming challenges and family love, don't forget to like the video, comment on what touched you the most, and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for our next exciting story.